Hi there, and welcome to a really special podcast episode in which I'm actually the guest. A few weeks ago, somebody contacted me on Instagram, wondering if I'd like to be a guest on their podcast, and their name was Dr. Yo, and their focus was on dizziness and hyperacusis when everything sounds really loud, and tinnitus, and she was an audiologist. So I checked out her content. And I was like, wow, I can tell that like me being a guest could bring a lot of value to her community because we have similar ideas. So I was excited to be a guest, and we're about to look at that episode now. I think this episode will be especially interesting to you if you've also struggled with dizziness. And although she's interviewing me, so we're talking mostly about sleep and insomnia, you can see by her reaction and her commentary that the answers that I'm giving are the same answers that she provides. The answers for insomnia are the same as they are for dizziness, chronic dizziness. And from just that, you can extrapolate that the answers are really the same for every version of this inner struggle that can come out in many different ways. Now, I also think this episode is really helpful if you're fairly new to the channel, or if you're looking for something that gives you kind of an overview, because when I'm a guest at a different podcast, they usually answer they usually ask the kind of big picture questions and the kind of first questions that somebody typically has when they start discovering our way and our teachings. So with that said, I hope you really enjoyed this episode with Dr. Yo. And by the way, if you're looking for more contextualized teachings for dizziness specifically, then you don't have to wait for long. Dr. Joe is actually going to be a guest on our channel. But with that said, here is my guest episode with Dr. Joe. Hope you'll enjoy.
Daniel, thank you so much for joining me today. Welcome.
Thanks so much. Excited to be here.
And I was just telling you before we started the recording that we're recording this right at the beginning of 2025, and I have been bombarded with questions about sleep problems over the last few days. It's like they knew you were coming on the channel, and so here we are. We've got the expert himself right here.
Oh, that's I'm very excited to get a chance to answer them, and and to be here in general. Every now and then people ask me, "Hey, do you want to join this podcast, or do you want to collaborate on this?" And 9 times out of 10, I look at like the person asking their content, and I say like, "Oh, this is not going to be a good fit." But when I saw your content, I was
Yeah.
like, "Oh, wow, oh, Jonas has the same ideas as I have." So very excited to be here.
Yeah, I think we overlap a lot, and one of my favorite things is when I speak to someone who's just kind of doing something a little different from what I'm doing, but then we end up reaching a lot of the same conclusions and are using a lot of the same techniques in our work. It's very affirming for me, first of all. So I really enjoy that. But also it 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 gives me a sense of relief on behalf of the people who ask questions about things like, in your case, insomnia, when they don't necessarily think of that as a dizziness related problem. And preview everyone, it's not really a dizziness related problem, it's a nervous system related problem, but we will get into all that, I'm sure. So I let's get started with you just sharing a little bit about yourself and how you got into this work.
Absolutely. So starting actually from, let's say, the very beginning, how I get into medicine, because my background is I am a medical doctor. My family is very much in the healthcare space. My mom is a nurse. My dad's a doctor. My sister is a doctor. Her husband is a nurse, et cetera, et cetera. So it was just very natural for me to become a doctor. And I actually did my medical school in Sweden, where I grew up. But I heard that in terms of like further education, residency training, the US was the best, like the best residence trainings in the US. So I was like, okay, I'm going to try to go there. It was not easy, but I did get a spot in pediatrics, which I love. So I did the pediatric residency. But I always knew I wanted to specialize in something. I knew I didn't want to become a generalist. I wanted to have my field of expertise. And a friend of mine just randomly said, "Hey, Daniel, do you know that there's a fellowship in sleep medicine?" I was like, "Really? You can become a sleep doctor?" I was so intrigued by that, read up on it, and I was fascinated and I was interested. So I applied and I got in. So I became a sleep doctor. I finished that fellowship in 2011. And then I started practicing. And as a sleep doctor, let's say 80% of your training is on sleep apnea, people who have trouble breathing during their sleep and maybe need a CPAP machine, et cetera, et cetera. But we were also trained on the basics of CBT-I, or cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is considered like the gold standard like therapy for insomnia. And when I started practicing, I realized that insomnia is just as big as a problem as sleep apnea. Maybe it's a bigger problem. Maybe more people suffer from that than anything else. And so I tried these CBT-I techniques, and sometimes it seemed to help, sometimes not. But I kind of I did my best for many, many years. But then in 2018, I had this idea that what I'm doing in the medical office, it's not making a difference. I'm talking to one person, at a time. I may reach maybe I can talk to 5 people in one day, but I'm never going to be able to reach a whole bunch of people. And my idea was still that CBT-I is effective, but it hasn't reached a broad audience. So I was thinking, I'm going to start a YouTube channel and I'm going to mass educate the world on CBT-I. And that became a mass education, for myself. I wasn't an expert at all. There was so much lacking in my understanding. But in this constant interaction with my community, my followers, my subscribers, I started to understand. I started to learn, and little by little, I gained, in my humble opinion, a quite thorough understanding of insomnia. And eventually that led me to a place where I'm no longer practicing medicine. I'm a full-time business owner. I've written many books on sleep. I oversee this entity called the Sleep Coach School, where we help people with insomnia. But essentially that's my journey from, let's say, sleep doctor to sleep coach.
No wonder we have reached so many of the same conclusions. I think we may be the same person. It's just so funny. I worked in conventional audiology. You were very diplomatic about it, so maybe you didn't experience the level of frustration that I had working as an audiologist in the settings that I was in. And it was also around 2018 when I had my crisis. So I call mine a crisis. Again, yours sounded a lot more dignified than mine. But also, when I started working with people with chronic dizziness kind of in a newer way, initially it was very CBT led as well, because that's actually also for people who are dealing with chronic dizziness symptoms. The gold standard that actually, unfortunately, most people don't even get is SSRIs, vestibular rehabilitation therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy. And my clients quickly taught me that that was not going to be enough, that you can't change the way someone thinks and expect that to change the way someone feels all the time. Changing the way someone thinks is really, really valuable. And I can't wait to hear how you are using the principles of CBT, specifically the CBT-I, which I've been exposed to. But it seemed inadequate for my purposes, and sounds like we reached that same conclusion.
Yeah. I think the journey is very, very similar. And I think maybe you were more, you saw at the time you were working with the system, you already saw how the system wasn't actually helping people, maybe creating more struggle for them.
Yes.
I wasn't initially at that level. It was more of a process for me when I started to realize how what I was doing was actually not helpful. But anyway, I think we landed at the same place in a very similar way.
Yes. Well, that does remind me to ask an important question just to kind of set up this conversation. Obviously, I'm asking you questions about insomnia because the people that I work with are dealing with chronic physical symptoms, often dizziness related symptoms, which has a whole host of other symptoms attached to it. Sometimes chronic pain, sometimes tinnitus or hyperacusis, sensitivity to sound for people who don't know what that is. But part of that group of symptoms, there's usually a component of physical arousal and or what people would identify as anxiety and worries. And there's almost always some difficulty getting rest, whether that's actual, by definition, insomnia, or people have trouble relaxing in general. So I get asked a lot about this, and I'm just wondering if, on your end, having worked with people with insomnia, if you've encountered people who are also dealing with other physical symptoms related to this nervous system sensitivity issue.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything you mentioned is very, very common in our community. In fact, I recently, I think this was just 2 weeks ago, I made a YouTube video talking about like the 50 most common experiences you have when you have insomnia. And these were things like dizziness, like tinnitus, like peeing a lot, like jerkiness,
Yes.
and there's a whole host of them, and basically shows us that what we what we think of as insomnia, what we call insomnia, it is a manifestation of hyperarousal. It's in the kind of anxiety space of struggles. So the way I see it is that anything you can experience when you are in this hyperaroused, hypervigilant, anxious state is going to be very, very common when you have anxiety. Whether it is again. Some jerks or some like funny sensation from the stomach, nausea, constipation, diarrhea. There's a ton of them, and it's so helpful, I think, for people to see that these are common. These are very, very common as part of the insomnia struggle. They do not mean that you have like a serious underlying medical condition. Of course, don't make it advice here. If you're concerned about your health, talk to your doctor. But this said, physical symptoms, very, very, very common as part of the insomnia struggle for sure.
That's right. And just because insomnia happens to be your primary symptom, or chronic dizziness happens to be your primary symptom, or tinnitus, or whatever it is, doesn't mean that they're actually distinct disorders, I would say. I don't know. Do you agree with me on that? You're nodding. Okay, good. Whew, okay. So let's define insomnia. So maybe you can start with the kind of the conventional definition of insomnia, and then I'd really love to hear how you think of insomnia.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I think that's a great place to start. So the conventional definition, if you look at like the DSM criteria, they would read something like this. If you have trouble falling asleep or trouble staying asleep for more than 3 days a week, for more than 3 months, you have insomnia. As you can see, it is purely descriptive. It says nothing about the reason you have trouble sleeping. So if we use the conventional description of insomnia with the conventional definition, someone who, for example, works for has a shift work job, and they happen to have trouble sleeping for nights in a week for a stretch of time, would be called an insomniac. So would a person who sleeps next to a snoring husband and has trouble sleeping. They would also have insomnia, right? But that isn't helping anyone, because again, it just describes what is going on. So technically, somebody with insomnia could say like, "Hey, why do I have insomnia?" And the doctor would say like, "Well, because you have trouble sleeping more than 4 nights per week."
Right.
Well, why do
I
you have
love
trouble
those
sleeping 4
circular.
nights a week?
Yes.
Well, because you have insomnia. It's unhelpful. So the way we define insomnia is that it is an ongoing self-perpetuating sleep struggle rooted in a fear of being awake or a fear of not sleeping. And for that to make more sense, let us talk with how insomnia typically starts. The classical story is that somebody is, either had no trouble sleeping whatsoever in their whole entire life. They were quote unquote a great sleeper, or somebody who was maybe a little bit of a light sleeper, maybe had a tendency towards more choppy sleep here and there, but they weren't bothered, Doesn't really matter. Somebody had no struggle with sleep whatsoever, and then something happens in their lives. They become a mom, they have a big exam, there's some stress at work, they move, something happens, and they have a bit of choppy sleep. And that is, of course, actually completely expected. From an evolutionary standpoint, when we are in what we perceive as in a somewhat threatening situation, we're supposed to be more alert, supposed to be more vigilant. We're supposed to sleep less. If we were a tribe living in the jungle and we heard some weird noises, we're supposed to sleep less and keep an eye out. So the fact that we sleep less when there's some stress in our lives, completely normal and expected. But what then happens is that we are in this place of threat detection. We think there may be something going on, and our brain makes this kind of mistake. It goes like, oh, wait a minute, I'm not sleeping. That shouldn't be happening. So essentially, the brain identifies not sleeping, aka being awake at night, as a threat, as a danger, as something that shouldn't be happening. And what then happens is now the initial reason we had some choppy sleep is irrelevant, because what now keeps us awake is our fear of not sleeping. And then, of course, when we're not sleeping, we go like, oh my gosh, this is a real problem now. What should I be doing? And we become more afraid of not sleeping, which keeps us awake more. And now this is what we call insomnia. So again, insomnia is an ongoing self-perpetuating struggle rooted in a fear of not sleeping. So it's all based on this fear, really.
If you had just replaced the word sleep essentially with dizziness, that would be a beautiful definition of neural circuit dizziness, of chronic dizziness symptoms that are I call them medically unexplained, not to imply that there's no neurological basis for them, but to indicate that there's no physical abnormality or disease process that's causing them to continue. Just to put that definition
Yeah,
out there, but same thing.
that goes back to what you said about, like, you said something along the lines that there's no kind of principal difference in a sense between like chronic dizziness and chronic insomnia. And I totally agree with that. It's the same idea, same thought. It's the same struggle. It's just that the focus was on a little bit different thing. That now one person may have the focus is on dizziness. Then we say, oh, this person has kind of chronic dizziness. They also have some sleep struggles, right? Or another person is more focused on the fact that they're not sleeping. Then they have insomnia, but they also have some struggles with dizziness. But it's the same exact thought process, same mechanism. It's the same entity, same struggle.
Okay, so now I have probably a bit of a nuanced question, but I'm sure you've been asked this question before. I get questions from people who say, but I'm not anxious. I don't have anxiety. I've never had anxiety. I'm not really afraid of not sleeping. It's actually the lack of sleep itself that's my problem. When I don't sleep, I feel so awful that that's the problem here. It's not really about the fear. It's about the fact that when I don't sleep, I feel awful. And of course, how am I supposed to not or accept that? Because that's awful. So what do you have to say to people who don't identify the anxiety and fear in this cycle?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I have gotten many times. And I think there are like two things I want to talk about here. And firstly is the experience of like, I'm not anxious, I'm just not sleeping, right? Well, one explanation here is the one that, some people are going to be resistant to, which is that maybe you are anxious, maybe you just don't identify anxiety, right? The fact that you're asking about it, you're curious about it, you're wondering, maybe that shows that you have some fear around it, right? And it's maybe an invitation towards like just honesty and self-exploration. But sometimes, and I think this is more rare, but sometimes being awake at night can come from another source. So the most typical one in insomnia is like the fear. The fear places us in this like hyper-vigilant, hyper-aroused state, in this readiness state, and that keeps us awake. But think about a child before Christmas. They can also be awake at night. They're not scared. They're excited, And a child before Christmas, their hyper-arousal comes from a state of like anticipating something positive, something nice, right? But they're also in this hyper-vigilant state, right? So what can happen is that we can have what we call like the wonder wall. In our teaching, we call it the wonder wall. And that's when pure curiosity and wondering why we're not sleeping keeps us awake, right? The hyperarousal comes from like this curiosity, this monitoring, not necessarily so much fear, but just like, I wonder why I'm not sleeping. Well, guess what? Wondering why you're not sleeping is enough to keep you awake. So that can happen. But I think most of the time there is actually some fear in at the bottom of this. Now going to the second part here, which is, as you already kind of deduced from our short conversation, what we see as the way of leaving insomnia is education, and also sort of a willingness to experience being awake at night, right? To accept the fact that yes, sometimes we are awake at night and we can't do anything about that, right? And then a natural kind of challenge to that is exactly what you bring up, which is somebody saying like, well, hey Daniel, like, how am I supposed to be okay with being awake at night when I feel utterly miserable the next day, right? How can you say there's no threat when I feel absolutely terrible? okay, maybe there's no biological, like physical threat, but I feel like I'm coming undone if I'm not sleeping enough. How do you meet that? Well, I then invite people who ask me that question to engage in this thought experiment. Okay, so we're going to take a random person off the street, and we're going to keep this person awake for 24 hours. So they were awake the day, we keep them awake a whole night, and then we ask them in the morning, like, how do you feel? Right? How do you feel now? You haven't slept at all. How do you feel? It's very likely that this person will indeed say, I feel a bit tired. I have it's a little bit hard for me to concentrate now. I'll feel a bit sleepy now, which shows that yes, not sleeping in itself, regardless of how we think about it, it can impact how we feel. It can make us feel a bit tired. True. We don't want to try to ignore that or downplay that this is true. However, what really matters is what this person will not say. So the random person that we kept up all night, what will they not say? Well, this person will not say, Daniel, I feel this tsunami of anxiety come over me. I feel completely hopeless. I can't think straight. I'm nauseous. I want to vomit. I feel so tired. I'm exhausted. I'm completely drained. I can't put the right foot in front of the next. We will not hear that, which shows us that what truly matters in terms of how we experience our day is not how many hours we slept, but the story around that, what we tell ourselves around that. If the story becomes, oh, the fact that you didn't sleep, it means something is wrong with me. It means you're damaged. It means you'll never sleep well again. That can make us feel really, really awful, not the little sleep in itself. And seeing that can be really, really an aha moment where people go from like, oh, I need to get more sleep to like, I need to just change the way I talk to myself and how I interpret things.
Yes. Wow. So well said. So well said. I'm smiling because again, you're channeling so much of the stuff I say to people about a totally different symptom that often, again, people think is unrelated, but obviously it's not. Um, okay. So one thing I didn't hear you say is you need to stop being afraid. So I've found that as a coaching tactic does not seem to work out very well. So here's what I'm hearing. What I'm hearing is a bit of that paradox that I encounter in my work a lot. That essentially what I'm telling people is that in order to fix your problem, you have to stop trying to fix it so hard. And this is taking us in a slightly different direction for a moment, but I think this is an important question to ask. So how do you think our conventional approach to insomnia, which involves a lot of fixing and lifestyle changes and like this is what you need to do to sleep, how do you think that is affecting people as a whole? And how do you undo some of the effects of that approach on people when they come to you for help?
Yeah, no, another great question. I would say this, that we should start with the what I think of as the most fundamental, like basic truth when it comes to sleep, the fundamental principle of really our work, which is that peaceful sleep is effortless. It requires absolutely nothing. It's an automatic physiological process that happens when we're not trying to make it happen. So sleep is effortless. For peaceful sleep is effortless. Sleep itself will happen. Even if you do everything quote unquote wrong and you try really hard to sleep, you will still sleep just because eventually you get so sleep that you will sleep. But what we want is this like peaceful, refreshing, a restful sleep. And that is effortless. That happens when we're not trying to do something. And for anyone out there who wants sort of proof of concept of that, think about someone in your life who sleeps really without any struggle and ask them like, what do you do? What's the key? What do you do? And you will get the secret, because that person will go like, I don't know. Like they'll shrug and go like, I don't know, which is like the proof they're not doing anything. Like, and so peaceful sleep comes from effortlessness. And unfortunately, as you alluded to, the conventional way we are told to meet insomnia involves a ton of effort. Most people have come across this under the umbrella term sleep hygiene. So sleep hygiene is essentially like a laundry list of things that we're supposed to do to sleep well. And these includes things like, keep your bedroom dark, keep it cool, don't eat too much before you go to bed, don't exercise too much before you go to bed, avoid coffee, don't drink alcohol, etc., etc. And all this is, of course, I'm sure it's well-meaning, but what unfortunately happens is that every little thing that a person who's now struggling a bit with sleep tries to do or avoid becomes what we call a sleep effort. It becomes an attempt to
Mm.
control their sleep, and it leads them away from this effortless process, right? So the more things they add on and pile on, the more they will struggle because the more effort will be introduced. And the same, I think, is true, unfortunately, for traditional CBT-I, where there's a lot of focus on controlling your sleep time. So the CBT-I idea is basically like, okay, force yourself to stay up really, really late so you're really, really sleepy, and get up early. And even if you're anxious about sleep, that sleepiness will just like overpower that anxiety and you will sleep, right? That's kind of the idea. And there's a lot of monitoring. There's a lot of like, oh, if you can't sleep within 15 minutes, get out of bed and then wait 15 minutes and check if you're sleeping, get up and monitor your sleep. It's all very, very, very tricky. All that, in my opinion, becomes part of this effortful approach, which actually leads to more and more sleep struggles, which then leads to, okay, so what do you do? If you meet somebody who is engaged in all these efforts for maybe years, you can't really tell that person, well, stop everything at once and stop being scared. There's nothing to be scared of. That won't work. I think of it often
Doesn't
as
work.
like,
Yeah.
it's like a little child who's scared of like a monster in their closet or something. We can't be like, there's no monster in the closet. That's silly. Then they'd be just more scared because they feel like there's not even anybody on their side, something like that. So a gentle way is really, really helpful. So I really think it all starts with education. Someone who comes to me, I would say like, well, all these sleep efforts that you're doing, you don't have to change anything right now. Just start by understanding, start by understanding what has happened to you. And as part of that educational process, you will understand that all these things you're doing to sleep is actually keeping you from sleeping well. And then the answer is like, it's right there in front of you, right? The answer is to not do so much. And then naturally, somebody who understands that will do less and less as a kind of a natural process, if you will. So I think that's how I see things.
Okay. So in that case, that person, it sounds like your efforts with that person might be on teaching them what to do with the fear, because it's you're basically telling them to stop doing all the other things and building all this effort around sleep. It sounds like, though, that person might need some better tools for working with the fear, because as we've already, you know, maybe made some jokes about so far, telling someone to stop being afraid really, really doesn't work. I love the monster in the closet metaphor. I actually use that same one all the time. So funny. As I said, I think we're basically the same person. Um, so, so how do you teach people skills around working with their fear? And are cognitive tools like just reframing and education all people need to know?
Yeah, that's a very nice question. Like going back to maybe like a more of a big picture discussion here about CBT in general,
Mhm.
I think there are a lot of things in the CBTI or CBT approach that make a lot of sense. Like the idea that thoughts aren't who you are, or thoughts aren't necessarily true, like looking at what's
Totally.
from the outside, very, very helpful, right? Now, the tricky thing I think with the traditional CBT approach is that it often lands in a place where you have the understanding that yes, thoughts, like how you think, is actually what produces emotions. Like emotions come from thoughts. So what you want to do here now is just willfully, deliberately changing your thoughts. That can be tricky. We can have like fleeting thoughts that are not very rooted in us. I usually use the example of melatonin. Like you have the idea that I need melatonin to sleep, but you don't necessarily believe that 100%. You've been taking melatonin a long time, but then you're like, you hear this thought in your mind, like, you have to take your melatonin to sleep. And you go like, no, I don't. I know that's not true. And you can sort of dismiss that thought. And maybe that thought kind of goes away or becomes unimportant. It doesn't happen so much because it was, your brain didn't believe it that much. So sometimes thoughts can be dismissed like that. But other times we have like deeply rooted fears and deeper rooted beliefs and thoughts like that can't really be dismissed, I think. And so maybe you have another thought that, uh, you know, whatever it is, if I don't sleep enough, I won't be able to drive my car or something like that. And maybe we really, really believe that. And if we try to dismiss that thought, it becomes like this this new inner struggle where the brain thinks it has something to communicate to you, and you're just to say, no, I want to hear it. Go away. And the brain goes like, no, this is important. You got to hear this. And it, in fact, amplifies the thoughts. You have more of them the more you try to resist it, right?
Exactly.
And in that situation, what do we do? To me, the answer becomes something like seeing it kind of becomes the same answer as for insomnia, seeing that having a thought in itself is harmless. Feeling anxious is harmless. It's not going to damage you. It's not dangerous. So kind of a willingness to experience the thought, a willingness to experience the emotion that come from the thought will sort of lead to the brain seeing like, oh, this message was delivered, this thought was heard. I don't have to repeat it again. And so that way, I think is really helpful. A little bit fuzzy, but that's essentially kind of the
Not at all.
tool, if you will.
That is, again, it's just, I'm smiling. For those of you just listening, I'm smiling because, and anyone who's listened to a lot of my content knows why I'm smiling, because you're just speaking my language here. The way I always describe this is emotions are just data that your brain wants you to have. It's important to your brain to deliver this data. It's anger, fear, disgust, whatever it is. It's an important piece of information from your brain's perspective that matters for survival. Your brain is very interested in your survival, so it wants to deliver the message. And when it doesn't feel like you've gotten the message, it keeps pressing the button. It's like, is this thing even on? Is this person even receiving anything? And the more you're like trying to run away from it or deny it, the harder your brain will just keep pressing the button to deliver this message. So you being able to tolerate the actual feeling shows your brain message received. You can stop pressing the button now. And what you just described, I think is from my perspective, probably the first or second step in resolving symptoms, whatever symptoms we're talking about. Being able to first identify the thought as separate from you, as you said, and then second, being able to tolerate and experience the feeling, whether that's the feeling that's causing the thought or the feeling that's being caused by the thought, whichever one it is. You don't even need to know. You need to be able to feel the feeling, whatever it is. Without necessarily, this is probably where I would say step 3 begins, and you referenced it already, without necessarily believing the story that has set this whole thing off. And I'd love to hear more about how you help people dismantle the story and identify the story that's coming with this whole scenario.
Yeah. Firstly, maybe just a quick comment on like your experience as being a host. I've had the same experience on the other side, which means like I've had guests on my channel, and I've been like so fascinated because they're saying the same things I say, with a little twist, with like
a little twist,
language or worse. And I often liken that to being like a biologist who like only been in Denmark their whole life, and then to Madagascar, like, oh wow, it's so different, but it's still the same. This is so bad. It's like it's
they have 4 legs too. Oh my gosh.
But yes, to your question, I would say that what probably helps more than anything else is to see that thousands of other people have had like the same story, and had the same ideas, and to see how a shift in their story and their ideas led to a resolution of their struggle. So what I think helps our community so much is all these quote unquote success stories. I say quote unquote because it's like tricky, because there's like, you don't want to look at sleeping as a success because it leads to performance anxiety, but everybody knows what a success story is, so I still use that word. But
sure.
I think when people really like hear other people's stories and they see like, oh my gosh, you had the exact same ideas. You also thought that you needed to wear your special PJs to sleep. You also thought that you couldn't sleep if you ate cheese. Oh my gosh, I've had those thoughts too. And now you no longer have those thoughts, and now you sleep well. Oh, like that insight that other people have gone through the same journey, and that their thoughts have changed, and that was really helpful. I think that's a key thing. And again, just the general education, the fundamentals also lead to thoughts changing automatically, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So let's walk through a scenario and see if we can apply these principles to this scenario. So let's just say symptoms of insomnia started with chronic dizziness symptoms. And there was some physiologic thing going on. And in fact, there may even still be a little bit of just high levels of physiologic anxiety that are maybe making it a little harder for the body to get into a deeply relaxed state. Let's say that's all going on. And this person has read a lot, has been trying really, really hard to get better, starting to read about nervous system regulation and says, oh, I'm just totally dysregulated and I need to stop being so afraid. And they're just kind of worked up about this. And then they also have this story in their head. Okay, if I don't sleep, I'm never going to get better from my dizziness symptoms. So I've really got to make sure that I'm sleeping. So I'm really afraid of being afraid of not sleeping, like the meta fear. So how can we apply some of the things you've talked about so far in that scenario to help this person dismantle all of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would maybe first start with saying that there's a difference between sleep disruption and insomnia, which we kind of touched on, but I think it's such a helpful distinction to understand that I want to spend like a little time on it. So very often people say, "Hey, Daniel, like it's not true. Like I've heard that having sleep apnea can cause insomnia. Are you saying that the fact that I'm having sleep apnea has no impact on my sleep, Daniel?" And I'm like, no, not at all. Of course, if you're snoring a lot or you're choking your sleep, that's going to disrupt your sleep. That's going to create some choppy sleep for you. Just as you said, if you have, for example, if somebody's really, really dizzy, then that in itself may cause some sleep disruption, but that's completely different from insomnia. Like insomnia is, again, this like, it's a fear around not sleeping that keeps us awake. And that's different from sleep disruption, where there's some external factor or something physiological within us that has a kind of a secondary effect that it keeps us awake, that's sleep disruption. So, keeping those things apart is really helpful. It can lead people to see that maybe you have both. Maybe there's something that's causing some disruption in your sleep, like say some life, like some stress in your life, that's causing you up a little bit, and you have some insomnia as well. Well, when you no longer have insomnia, you're no longer afraid around sleep. You may still have some sleep disruption, some choppy sleep here and there, but it's not going to impact you very much because it's not this emotional deep struggle, right? So just clarifying that. Now, in this instance that we have a student, a client, who essentially is afraid of being afraid in some way, right? Which is actually very common. It sounds like that should be something unusual, but it's actually very, very common.
Super common.
I think the answer lies in understanding that we are safe despite our experiences. So at the core of all these struggles, whatever it is, I think, is this kind of misclassification, this misunderstanding that something that's inherently harmful is a threat. Something that's inherently harmless has been mislabeled as a threat. And regardless of what what the thing was that was mislabeled, the answer always becomes the same. So when being awake at night is mislabeled as a threat, we have insomnia. And the way we, in our kind of language, we meet that is we call it befriending wakefulness. That instead of looking at wakefulness as a threat or a foe to escape, we say, see if you can befriend it. It doesn't mean you have to like it or enjoy it, but see if it can be, like you said, tolerable, if you can tolerate it, right? And same thing, if fear is mislabeled as a threat, if you start thinking like, oh, I can't be scared, that's dysregulating my nervous system, then now what's happened is like fear has been mislabeled as a threat. Like fear is now a perceived threat. So what do we want to do here is, again, like befriend it. Befriend the fear, as impossible as it might sound. Like, again, it's not about liking it, enjoying being scared. Nobody enjoys that, but tolerate it. What can make it easier for you to feel scared if you feel scared? So I think it's always about kind of befriending, befriending the dizziness, befriending the wakefulness, befriending the fear, befriending anything that you have previously looked at as a threat. That's going to lead to a peaceful state of mind where none of these things bother you.
Excellent. Okay, so one thing I want to clarify with you, I think we're going to be on the same page about this one. Often what people think of as befriending is not befriending. It's trying to soothe your fear, which often can be kind of compulsively trying to soothe. I'm not allowed to feel fear. Okay, I'm going to do my deep breathing exercises. I'm going to do a sleeping meditation, and I'm going to be in my special, room that I've set up to help me befriend my sleeplessness or my wakefulness and my symptoms or whatever, that all, it can look like befriending. It can all be good things, but if it's being applied in this go away, I can't tolerate you way, then it's not befriending.
Yeah, 100%, exactly. If the intent is to get rid of it, it's not befriending. It's essentially like somebody said, like, hey Daniel, like I befriended wakefulness for 2 weeks, but I'm still not sleeping anymore. Then you like
Right,
you
right,
see, the intent was to get more sleep,
right,
right? So
right.
exactly.
Which makes it, we understand, a huge catch 22, because we're telling you, okay, you can befriend sleep, but not to try to make yourself sleep, even though you're here because you're not sleeping. Like we know what we're asking you to do is really hard. So I'm wondering if you have any practical tools or suggestions, things that have worked for your clients to help them get into that better intent, to into that state of mind where they're truly befriending wakefulness or fears or worries. What are some of the things that you teach people to do?
I would say that there is, well, I would say start here that simply learning kind of cognitive understanding in education is really helpful. But often what really leads to a shift is actually the experiential learning, you know?
Yes.
And so often it's when somebody starts from a pure intellectual standpoint, they start reading a book or learning, and then something happens, They have this night when they're like, whoa, I fell asleep without a promise. I slept great all night. And in the past, when this person was kind of uneducated, they might have been like, oh, what was it? Was it that I didn't eat cheese? Was it that, oh, no, I took a long walk. There was a long walk, right? And it becomes tricky because it becomes another path to more effort and trying, right? But when a person is educated, they have this kind of magical moment experience, and they're like, oh, this happened because I wasn't trying. This happened because I was okay to experience whatever was going to happen. And it becomes this like deeper, like experiential learning, which in some mysterious and magical way leads to this like thought, changes, like this deep-seated changes that, leads to where you want to be. So experiential learning, I think, really, really helps.
Okay. Can you, again, just, I'm gonna push you on this, because I know lots of people watching this are like, okay, all right, I can kind of buy into this, but I'm just so miserable. I'm physically miserable because I'm so darn tired. I have these stupid physical symptoms on top of it. I'm just not, it's so hard for me to do this without the intent of trying to get rid of it. So, Daniel, do you have anything you can walk me through, or any stories or any exercises that you can do to kind of help me see the difference or experience the difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think we have so far mostly been kind of a big picture, space, which I think is where you want to start because you want the kind of big picture
Sure.
understanding. But how about on a practical level, right? How can we approach this? Well, when somebody has understood where their insomnia comes from, I think one thing that is really helpful is this befriending wakefulness concept. But on a more practical level, what does it mean? What does befriending wakefulness actually mean in kind of like in practical terms? Well, what we typically do when we have trouble sleeping and we find ourselves awake at night is that we try to force sleep. We try to put on the meditation tape. We put on the blue blocking glasses or whatever it is, and we try to force sleep to happen, which creates more struggle with us. So befriending wakefulness is anything that makes it a little easier for you to accept the fact that you're awake at night. And that can mean, for example, having a nice book, that you enjoy to read, like, or a podcast or a Netflix show. And people are like, what? Netflix? Can I watch put a screen on and watch? Yes, of course.
Oh
Like,
no, it's going to mess up my brain and then
it's
I'll never sleep
fine.
again. Yes, yes,
if,
yes.
if if the fact that you're watching a show like in the middle of the night leads you to a place where you're like okay with being awake, it teaches the brain that being awake is not a threat, and it's really, really helpful. So so that's really nice. And sometimes people they go like, well, Daniel, like if I read a book that I actually enjoy, isn't that going to make me more awake? And then I was like, now you're onto something. Now you really discovered something. You
Bring it
discovered,
on.
yeah, right? What you've discovered is that you're afraid of being awake, right? Because the question comes from like, won't that make me awake? You've just discovered your own fear of wakefulness, which is what keeps you awake at night. So if you find that, if the question came up for anyone listening, like, oh, if I do something enjoyable at night, won't that make me more awake? You've just discovered your fear of wakefulness, which is like even more inviting you to do something you actually enjoy, right? So that's kind of a practical level of befriending wakefulness. What often comes up is people say like, well, Daniel, like, I don't want to do something enjoyable. Like, there's nothing enjoyable for me at night. Like, I'm just so tired. I'm drained. And if I'm honest with myself, I just want to sleep. And then I always say like, well, honesty is really helpful. You can't force yourself to enjoy something if it doesn't feel enjoyable to you. But guess what? Just resting is nice. If you just want to rest with your eyes closed, that's just as much befriending wakefulness as like watching a Netflix show. That's just fine. Anything that isn't an attempt to force sleep is befriending wakefulness, really, really helpful. So befriending wakefulness, talk a little bit about that. The second thing that is practical is what we call the timeless night or the timeless way. And so what does this mean? Well, another very common tricky part of insomnia is the monitoring of time. And this is a person who is like, they checking what time they go to bed, how long it takes them to fall asleep. They have maybe a tracker, and every time they wake up, they check what time it is and how long they slept, et cetera, et cetera. And firstly, I want to say that this is not an invitation for self-criticism. It's very natural. When we feel like we lost control of our sleep, what can give us a sense of control is tracking time and monitoring time. Of course, it's very natural that we do that. However, it's tricky because no matter what happens, it leads to performance anxiety. If you find that you weren't sleeping enough according to your calculations or your math, then you're going to be like, I need to sleep more. And that's going to introduce effort, right? And if you find that, oh, yesterday I slept enough. I slept 7.5 hours. Then the idea is going to be like, how do I repeat that, right? Which also leads to performance anxiety. So not knowing what time it is, not tracking time is super, super helpful. And how can we practically do that? I think
I just want to point out that's in opposition to what CBT-I often does, which is so micromanaged. I'm glad you said that, because that is, I could, again, I work with people also who are dealing with a lot of fear. And boy, if you throw a structured schedule at someone who's dealing with a lot of fear, it can become just a new point of fear and obsession. So
100%.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, but yeah.
No, not at all. And actually the majority, I would say, I think it's actually the majority of the people we work with have tried CBT-I and found it to be like just exacerbating their struggle because of exactly what you pointed out. So unfortunate that this is the quote unquote gold standard. But anyways, on a practical level, what I often say is ask people is, okay, what time is, because of obligations, what time do you usually have to get up in the morning? And let's say somebody says, well, it's convenient for me to get up at 6. Okay, well, good. And set an alarm at 6. And that's kind of when you start your day. And then think about the evening time. When would you say that your day changes into night? And what I mean by that is sort of like the energy around how we think about day and night, meaning like we think of the day as like this for getting things done, work, obligations, tasks, that's our day. And then night is for nothing. Like it's for resting. It's for no obligations. And when we don't have to do anything. When does that start for you? And let's say maybe somebody says, well, I think my night starts at like maybe 10, right? Then I'd be like, okay, so what you can do now is like from 10 or so until your alarm goes off in the morning, you just make a point of not knowing the time. You just do what you feel like. If you feel like, watching a show, good. If you feel like talking to a neighbor, good, do that. Like, do whatever you feel like. And sometimes people go like, so when do I go to bed? Same thing. Like, go to bed when you feel like it. Don't make it a chore or pressure point or anything like that. If you feel like going to bed early, that's great. And that timeless way, which makes everything kind of fuzzy and unclear, is really, really helpful because it kind of nudges us or invites us to this kind of effortless way. So befriending wakefulness, very helpful. The timeless way is really, really helpful. And I had 3 more kind of practical tips that I prepared as I was reading your messages. And one of them is to use the internet or use information in kind of a wise way, which means not to Google things to kind of problem solve, right? Because that's a real rabbit hole, right? So many in our community go like spend hours like problem solving and searching online. So I would invite anybody that has trouble sleeping to say like, just maybe just as an experiment, just for 2 weeks or something, say like, I'm not going to use the internet to problem solve my sleep or anything like that. That can be really helpful. Number two, maybe don't talk about your sleep. Like so many people are like, the first thing friends and family member ask them is like, how do you sleep last night? And that invites
Yeah.
them to like talk about it and spend time. So like maybe also just see what happens if you just tell people like, I'm not interested in talking about sleep for now. See where that leads you. And then if you use a tracker or a monitor like that, maybe see where we're not using that leads you. And then those are kind of practical things that can really help.
Wow. Oh, those are all really good pieces of advice. Goodness. Uh, and all of those, again, I can see the common thread between them is you're 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 trying to reduce the fear of the symptom itself and the fear of the symptom itself. By doing those things, you're taking the pressure off. And that, as I was hearing you say this, I was noticing a sense of relief on behalf of the people who are struggling sleeping right now, whether they're dealing with dizziness, tinnitus, hyperacusis, or something totally different, or maybe just sleep issues. And it made me think. So we've focused very specifically on the fear of the sensation or the lack of sleep itself. We've focused a lot on the fear of the fear. Are there any other things that you've identified that seem to play into this? And I guess I should say that this is something you mentioned at the very beginning, that sometimes people might have had a stressful period of time that kind of led to this choppy sleep that then morphed into insomnia, which is a separate phenomenon. But I'm wondering if you've ever noticed with some clients that that early stressful experience is actually something that does need to be addressed in some way for them to succeed using your approach. And to phrase it one more way, again, just because I know you understood, but just want to make sure people who are listening understand what I'm asking. Are there other things that can cause someone to be very sensitive to fear beyond the fear of the sleep itself that maybe relate to other things going on in that person's life?
Yeah, I definitely believe so. And I would say if somebody let's just make up a scenario here is having like they have a really stressful job that they don't particularly like, and that was the initial cause for the sleep disruption that then became insomnia, right?
Yes.
And let's say they're, thanks to kind of education and taking this journey within and acceptance and all of this, their insomnia is not a factor anymore, but they're still having a lot of stress. They're still having choppy sleep. Well, maybe in some cases that's something you want to look at. Maybe there's something that's going on in your life in practical, in the kind of actual, day-to-day parts of your life that you may want to change. That could be a case. And now you also asked sort of like, apart from what we talked about, are there other factors that can keep a person
Afraid.
in
Yeah.
a state of like fear or
Yeah.
like having an
Hmm.
ongoing fearful? I would say yes. I think we kind of actually touched upon it, but what I often find is somebody saying like, hey Daniel, I think my struggle with insomnia is not so much an issue for me, but I still struggle a lot with anxiety and then maybe ask about that. So how do we approach that? Well, I do X, Y, and Z to get rid of the anxiety, right? So it's the same thing that can happen in life in general that we may not connect the dots. So somebody may be in a place where they've kind of accepted wakefulness and they don't struggle with insomnia, but there's something else that they're trying to push away, and oftentimes it is the kind of like the very fundamentals, like the feeling scared or feeling anxious, right? So I'd and it can be tricky because if we're habitually trying to escape things in one aspect of our lives, it can kind of spill over to other aspects, et cetera, et cetera. So like just seeing that it's sort of all the same is really, really helpful. And oh yeah. One little thing to add here that can be helpful. Another source of fear around sleep is what we hear about the effects of not sleeping on our health. So I think that this is really helpful to talk about. A lot of people go like, "Hey Daniel, how can you say like I don't need to worry if I'm awake at night when studies show that if you don't
Yes.
sleep enough, you'll get dementia, or studies show if you don't sleep enough,
Yes.
you'll get cancer, things of that nature."
Yes.
Well, guess what? No medical advice here, but I've studied this extensively, and there's no evidence for this. Like there's no causal link. There's no evidence showing that little sleep or insomnia causes any health problem, right? There is no such evidence. What we do, like when you see a headline like, oh, insomnia linked to diabetes. What they have found in this study invariably is that they talk to people who have diabetes and they ask like, how do you feel you sleep? And they say it's like, I don't sleep very well. And they talk to people who don't have diabetes, and like, how do you sleep? And they say like, I sleep pretty good. And they're like, oh, look, there's a link between little sleep and diabetes. So, you should get your 7 hours. But of course, that's not the,
Right.
the case is different. The causality is reversed. It is that when we have health issues, that tends to cause sleep disruption. That tends to, diabetes or cancer or pulmonary disease or dementia. They all impact our sleep, not the other way around. So again, I found zero evidence for short sleep or insomnia causing any health issues. In fact, there was a very, very big study, meta-analysis that came out, was like 3-4 years ago from Lack and Lovato, this Australian group, where they had a total of like, I think it was 36 million people. And they saw that people who identified as having insomnia versus not had the exact same life expectancy. There was zero difference. And I thought, that studies like that are really reassuring. So I want to mention that as well.
That is an excellent point. And actually, you're touching on one of the things that I was thinking about when I asked you the previous question. So, first of all, just point made, and it's wonderful to hear that. Also very reassuring. I hope people heard that and maybe want to rewind and listen to that a few times. That is actually just it's overblown. Just because there's a correlation between two things doesn't mean that you not sleeping right now or you sleeping poorly right now means that in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years you're going to have this problem. However, if you have that kind of thinking, then that's an indication that herein lies our problem. So while the sleep is certainly or the lack thereof is certainly very uncomfortable, and we're trying to address it via this conversation and the wonderful coaching that you do and your team does, Daniel, uh, we the actual problem here is that your brain right now is doing this projection and worrying about these future possibilities in 10, 20, 30 years. That's actually what's keeping you from having good sleep, and also if in the case of a lot of the people that I'm working with having chronic symptoms. It's because your brain is wrapped up in this fear story, and you're there instead of where you need to be, which is right here right now, and that is actually the reason for all of this fear that's keeping symptoms going. But that also brings me to this just kind of bigger problem that I see, again, a lot among my folks, just long-standing histories of health anxiety. And so the dizziness is not the first rodeo. It's maybe the most distressing one that they've had, or maybe insomnia is not their first rodeo, but it's the most distressing they've ever had. Everyone finds different symptoms the most distressing. But often people will see the particular problem they have, or rather the particular symptom they have, as the problem that needs to be solved, when bigger picture, the problem is just that your brain has this way of dealing with stress and dealing with the uncertainty inherent in living. And we can dismantle your thoughts around insomnia or around dizziness, but we really need to be addressing the bigger problem, which is this is kind of the mode your brain likes to go into when faced with stress or doubts or uncertainty.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. You certainly have some clients, some students who've never struggled with anything really, live happily
Sure.
and then have insomnia, and then
Absolutely.
the
Yes,
insomnia is
absolutely.
resolved, and that was that. But you're hopeful that that person understood that what you learned here also applies if you ever have any other similar struggle, right? But that
Mhm.
happens. But as you said, there are also a lot of students who've had like you said, more of like a health anxiety type situation where there was a fear around digestion, and they had like IBS for a while. Now they
Yes.
all that now. there was a fear around Lyme disease. Now that's resolved. There's a fear around long COVID. Now that's resolved. Now it's et cetera, et cetera. And to me, like the sort of what this boils down to for me is that uncertainty that you mentioned. That's inherent, like the inherent uncertainty of living. And I like to illustrate that by saying that, let's say somebody has a spot on their skin, right? and they kind of know that they have anxiety, know that this is probably nothing, but maybe I should check it out, maybe not, and they get more and more worried about it, and they finally say, I'm going to go see a doctor. They get a biopsy done, and they're going to get the results, and now they're super anxious. What if it's melanoma? What if it's a skin cancer? They get the result, and like, no, it's a benign mole. It was nothing. And immediately, like, their anxiety kind of just completely melts away. It feels so great. And it can seem here that they did the right thing. They had a fear around their health, and they make sure there was nothing to be worried about. Feels great. It can seem like that is the right thing to do. And again, without no medical advice here, if you're worried about your health, of course, talk to your doctor. However, whenever you get that release in terms of one aspect of your health, it can lead you to think that uncertainty is not acceptable. And bring it back to what we talked about earlier. To me, this is where what's perceived as a threat here when it comes to health anxiety is uncertainty about one's health. Uncertainty about one's health seems to be a threat, unacceptable, something we shouldn't have. And that leads to like this ongoing thing where there's continuously some new thing that pops up that we need reassurance for, right? So to me, the answer here becomes sort of like befriending uncertainty, still use the same language. And what does that look like? Well, if you have the sense that you have a health anxiety and something new pops up, then you can see that, yes, maybe you want to make sure, talk to your doctor, etc. But maybe you want to take note of the fact that no human being on this planet knows anything about their health for certain. Like if you ask me, like, Daniel, how's your pancreas today? I have no idea. How's your kidney? No idea, right? Mm-hmm. But we can live happily even with uncertainty without knowing anything about our health. So going towards a place where we accept, we tolerate, we befriend uncertainty, I think really helps in this space.
Yeah. And this is, I mean, this could be probably the topic of an entire conversation. Just this, the uncertainty piece. I've done, Daniel, a lot of extra training over the years in the kinds of treatments that are used for obsessive compulsive disorder, not because everyone watching this has OCD or even that a large number of them do, but just people end up with these kind of obsessive compulsive cycles, just like you described, where they get this big relief and anxiety from doing the checking or the researching or the getting reassurance. And ultimately that way of coping with things can work for a while if you're not facing something really big and scary. But when you have a symptom like dizziness or tinnitus or hyperacusis or insomnia or anything else that's really frightening you, or maybe you're in a particularly vulnerable state, you've been very stressed out, your friends and family aren't being supportive, those strategies that have kind of helped you coast along for a while can become they don't just feed the symptoms, they can grow into their own monster. And that, to me, like you, my hope always is when I help someone with dizziness, for most people, all they really need to do is stop fearing the symptoms, understand what they are, and get back to life in a gradual way while being nice to themselves. That's pretty much the formula right there, guys. You heard it. That's pretty much it. But the devil's in the details. and my hope always is that someone's going to take more than that from this process of recovery and learn the kinds of skills that we're talking about, because as you say, this is a global skill that can apply to so many different kinds of symptoms.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm sure you've heard this many times. We surely hear this all the time, is when somebody says insomnia was a gift. It sounds insane to somebody who's struggling with this now, but so many people say that it was a gift because it led me to understand things I would never have understood before, and my entire life has become easier now. There's so many things I tried to control in my life before that I no longer try to to control. And I just randomly on TikTok saw this this person who said like things I regret about Ozempic. And in the first picture, she was overweight, and then in the next picture, she's like really lean, and then says nothing. And of course, I'm happy for this person who, of course, wanted to lose weight, and I'm sure lost weight. But my immediate reaction when I saw it was like, oh my gosh, you could have learned so much from approaching this in another way, right? There's so much learning that could be life-changing that didn't happen for you, I assume. So like all these struggles we have, they are an invitation for this inner journey that can be so transformative. So yeah, 100% agree with you.
So well said. And I think you and I both agree, if there were a pill that would actually resolve insomnia, not just mask the problem and put people to sleep, but if there were a pill that would just magically rewire your brain so that you would just wouldn't have insomnia anymore, or likewise for dizziness, I'm never going to be the person who would say, oh no, you shouldn't do that. You should take the journey instead. But at the same time, like you, I would feel sad seeing what I've seen, seeing the kinds of changes people make in their lives, and especially in the way they relate to themselves. That's the big one. They treat themselves so differently when this is done. Again, I would never put it on someone that it's a gift, but if you listen to the success stories on my channel, and apparently on yours too, I think they're going to be hearing the same thing, that people come out the other side uh, with so much growth.
Yeah. And they see
Yeah,
like it wasn't really about dizziness after all, right? It wasn't really
right.
about that. It was something else. It was something deeper. And
Yes.
I can sense that you, like myself, believe that like self-kindness is so, so helpful, and it's hard for people to see that. And I understand that because we're in this, we have a problem, we want to fix the problem, and we often don't see how critical we are of ourselves, how much pressure we put on ourselves, etc. And yeah, self-kindness, I think, is so helpful. One of the most helpful things, ever invented, quote unquote.
Right. Well, I mean, I feel like that's a perfect note upon which to end our conversation here. Just tell me if you agree with this. All of the things that we talked about today, you gave some wonderful ideas and tools. The more you can treat this like a friendly experiment and um, treat yourself with a lot of grace in the process, the more smoothly this is going to go.
Yeah, yeah, 100% agree with that. No doubt when I'm sure you use the same analogy, same example, but if you think about a friend who had tells you like, oh, I hardly slept last night, what will you say to your friend? Would you say like, what's wrong with you? Why can't you sleep like a normal person? Like, get a grip, like, get over this.
What time did you go to bed last night? Did you
Yeah,
go for a walk yesterday?
you'd never do that. You'd be like, it's okay. You give them a hug, and when you treat yourself that way, the struggle really, really melts away for sure.
Wonderful. One final thing before we close. I would love if you would like to share any hope with people listening who are having trouble with sleep. What have you seen? Are people able to recover from insomnia?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I know, as you point out, that for so many out there, it seems like they're in a hopeless situation where they're the one person in the world who is not able to sleep, who is broken, has some brain injury or something like that. But the thing is that sleeping is like breathing or thinking. It's just a physiological process that can never be taken away from us. Your sleep system can never be broken. Your faith in your sleep system, can be shaken, and that can make it look like, you have a broken sleep system. That's never ever the case. And I know for somebody out hearing this, I never met you, I've never heard your story, but I know your story because it's the same story as everyone else's with insomnia. And when you see that, when you see there's nothing broken within you, there's nothing abnormal happening, this is just a little bit of frazzlement, a little bit of a misunderstanding, and you see that once you're ready for this journey within, learning a little bit, deploying self-kindness, you too will find peaceful sleep and peace of mind come your way.
Amen. Amen to all of that. Daniel, thank you so much. Now, I want people to be able to find you. So, where are the best places for them to find you and your work?
I think it's definitely YouTube. So anyone hearing this, if you search the Sleep Coach School on YouTube, you're going to find our channel. And
I'll
there's,
tag you too in the
yeah, I
video
do that.
description, the podcast description.
I think it's great because there's tons of just, free education, their success stories, their interviews, and that alone, I think will be really, really helpful to anyone out there.
Yes, long form content for the win with nuance and detail and step by step processes and reassurance all together. So, totally, totally glad that you're here on YouTube and not just producing 30-second TikToks. That's very, very much appreciated. Okay, well, wonderful. And if someone wants to get in touch, maybe get help through one of your coaches, is the best place to start on your YouTube channel or on your website?
Yeah, I would say to anyone, like, definitely start with the YouTube channel and just get a sense of how we teach and our material, and make sure it kind of resonates with you. Now, if they're from you, from your community, I'm sure they're going to
Probably
be
going
like,
to
oh, this is
resonate.
just the same thing in a different language. But anyway,
Yes.
if somebody wants more help than, the free material out there, then go to our website, thesleepcoachschool.com. And we have an app that's really neat. It's like very low cost, and we have this like chatbot that I designed. So it's essentially
So
talking
cool.
my language, but it's like, it's not 100% because it's a bot, but that's you can start there, and you can buy one-on-one calls, you can join our group coaching program, et cetera, et cetera. So there's tons of stuff there. If you're interested, just, thesleepcoachschool.com.
Daniel, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you. This was an amazing conversation. Going to bring so much great information and reassurance to a lot of people out there. And all of you, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate you being here as always. If you could like the video, share it if you found it useful, comment, let us know what you thought, share your questions below if you're here on YouTube. If you're listening to this as a podcast, head on over to the YouTube channel if you want to participate in the discussion. We always have fun answering the comments and seeing what information you feel you might need moving forward. Also, please be sure to subscribe to my channel, follow the podcast if you're listening to this as a podcast. And as always, thank you all so much for being here. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks so much. Take care, Daniel.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Hi, it's me, Coach Daniel, and I hope you found the video you just saw full of inspirational content and full of educational content as well, because that's really what we try to do here in the school. We try to educate and inspire. And if you're finding that things are clicking for you and sleep is happening easier and you're leaving the struggle, please let us know in the comment section, because we live for that. We live for hearing how somebody is finding sleep and life becoming lighter and easier. And not only are you doing us a huge favor as sleep coaches and like filling our tank with that gas that makes us never want to stop doing this, but you're also helping the community. You're helping by inspiring other people, and by commenting, you're telling YouTube that this was interesting, and YouTube feeds our content to more people so that they can discover our teachings and things get easier for them. So again, if you found things getting easier for you, please let us know in the comment section. We can't wait to hear from you.